John Redwood.
Madam Deputy Speaker. I've declared my business interests in the register, but I'm not planning to talk about those today. Well, what a catalogue of misery from the spokesman for the SNP. It's just bizarre. I thought there was an SNP government in Scotland. I thought she might have found something that she was proud about Scottish public services or the state of the Scottish economy. But no, everything is miserable, and everything, of course, is the direct fault of the Westminster Parliament. They take no responsibility for anything. I thought they'd put taxes up and that they were going to endow their public services even more. She doesn't mention that. Maybe she doesn't like the economic consequences that might have, but it's absolutely typical that we get nothing positive and they accept no responsibility for the economy. Because I want to talk today, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the huge opportunities that there are for the United Kingdom economy as we leave the European Union. And I know it's fashionable on the opposition benches to be wholly negative about the Brexit their constituents voted for, and to be wholly negative about the Brexit they said they would put through in their manifesto in 2017 to try and keep their vote and to have some confidence from their vote. But their voters, like me, think that there are huge opportunities for a more prosperous and more successful United Kingdom outside the European Union than inside it. I give way.
Throw out one gentleman for giving way, and he talks about us talking about misery, but can I enlighten with a bit of reality? This week, Dunnes Stores, an Irish-based company, which is a store in the Parkhead Forge in my own constituency, just announced that it was closing down. That will have a direct impact on jobs in my constituency, and they've said that is because of Brexit. That is the reality.
Mr. Speaker, I can find many examples of companies that have come pouring in with extra investment post the Brexit vote, and the national figures show that we have more jobs, more investment and more growth following the Brexit vote. And let me begin with just that. We had these ridiculously pessimistic Treasury forecasts launched just in time for the referendum vote. I and a few others at the time put our professional reputations on the line and said these are completely wrong, and we explained why the economics behind them was very misleading and the forecasts were likely to prove wildly inaccurate. We were right. The Treasury and the World Bank and others were comprehensively wrong, and they had been rightly confounded, and I'm very pleased my right honourable friend, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, agrees with me that it is a pleasure that these forecasts were wrong. I also think she and the Chancellor are exactly right to be cautious about the latest set of official forecasts. I think they are likely to prove too pessimistic for the future years, and it is very important that we aim to beat those forecasts. We know that they keep changing the forecasts, we know that they tend to be too pessimistic on average, and I think now is a very good opportunity to go out and beat those forecasts and make that one of the main aims of our policy. And I look forward to opposition members trying to help us instead of doing all they can to peddle misery and gloom to try and dampen spirits and reduce confidence at a time when there are good reasons to be more confident and good reasons to believe those forecasts are wrong. Let me take one obvious point. Now, I think I do have some disagreement with the front bench, because I would actually like to stop paying any money to the European Union after March 2019. Some of my colleagues on the front bench seem to be wishing to be more generous, but I think they agree with me that quite soon we must get to the point where we're not paying any more money to the European Union. When we have full control of our money, as we voted to do, that is 12 billion that we can spend on our priorities here in the United Kingdom rather than on their priorities somewhere else across the continent. And this will give us an immediate 0.6% GDP boost. And when you're growing at 1.5 to 2%, an extra 0.6% is a material improvement in your growth rate. And we don't just get that 12 billion as a one-off in the first year, we get it in every successive year because we have that money available to spend. And I campaigned in the last election to say that I did wish to see the Brexit vote properly implemented, and my constituents gave me a majority, knowing that was my view. And I also campaigned on the ticket of prosperity, not austerity. And I do want more money spent on the schools in Wokingham and the hospitals in the local area, and I'm very pleased with the latest settlement that we have, because I think health staff need more money, and I'm very pleased that the weighting of the percentage increases is much more generous to those on low pay, because in my area it's extremely difficult getting by on those low pay rates, and we need to recruit and retain more and to give more people more hope in those jobs and hope they can go on to to better paid jobs with good career progression. So I want more money spent, but I don't want it spent in an irresponsible way. So I'm offering the government the biggest spending cut they're ever going to do, which is the $12 billion a year, which we don't need to keep on sending to Brussels in the spirit of the Brexit vote. Bring our money back, take control of our money, and spend it on our priorities. Prior to the referendum, I took the precaution of setting out a draft budget that I would like the government to adopt. I explained in the referendum I was very unlikely to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, and therefore you couldn't take it as a promise, but it was a set of ideas on how that money could be spent, mainly more spending on areas like health and social care and education, but also some tax reductions, getting rid of the damaging VAT rates that we have on green products, on feminine hygiene products, and on domestic heating fuel, hitting those on lowest pay the most heavily. And these are things we cannot do for ourselves all the time we're in the European Union.
The government's failure to negotiate a zero rate in the tampon tax doesn't give us great hope for any further negotiations with the EU.
The Honourable Lady will agree that this is one area where even she must see that getting out of the EU is a big positive, because she and I will be able to unite on something for once and shove through this House the abolition of this much-hated tax. And isn't it a disgrace that the world's fifth largest economy and an important country cannot even control its own taxes, although over all those years in the EU we were assured by governments of all persuasions that tax was a red line and we would always be able to decide in this House of Commons what the tax rates were going to be and what was going to have to be taxed, and that simply isn't true until we've left the EU. So there's the first bonus. The Brexit dividend is to take control of our money, spend it on our priorities. It has a double advantage, because not only does it give a boost to growth the first time you do it, but it also has the advantage that it cuts our balance of payments deficit. And I am more worried about our balance of payments deficit than our state deficit, because the government has done a great job in getting the state deficit down to perfectly reasonable levels, whereas the balance of payments deficit needs working on, and the simplest way of cutting the balance of payments deficit is to stop sending money to the EU, because that is like a load of imports.
I wish to ask him a serious question. I mean, he is an honourable member, very well remunerated for his views on finance, very much a man sought after for advice in the city, and he will know if we were to lose just 10% of, say, the financial services sector in this UK as a result of market access ending through Brexit, that would constitute a loss of £8 to £9 billion in taxation to this country. Is he genuinely not worried at all that there are things we need to retain about our relationship or economic relationship with the European Union as part of those Brexit talks?
I'm an optimist. I think we have a perfectly good economic relationship, even if we don't get a comprehensive formal deal of the kind that I know the front bench would really like to secure. He shakes his head. Well, let me give him the evidence. When I studied this subject before the referendum, because I always like to make sure I'm giving good advice and I try and find out what I'm talking about and have some facts, I studied the economic performance of the United Kingdom during the early 1970s when we first entered the European Economic Community. And then again, I took great interest in the economic growth rate around 1992 when the single market was completed, which people say is so crucial to our growth rate. And I can assure the honourable gentleman, you cannot see any positive kick-up in the graph for UK growth, either when we first joined the EEC or when they completed the single market in the early 1990s. Indeed, actually, the growth rate fell off on both occasions. I don't blame the EU for all of that, but it shows that there was no great benefit. So if there was no benefit going into the thing, why should there be something negative when we come out of the thing? It isn't asymmetric. There will not be a hit. And I promise him that when we look back on it all in 5 years' time or so, you will not be able to see, certainly on world growth graphs, and I suspect on UK economic graphs either, where you left the EU. It won't be a big economic event. It's a massively important political event. I don't think it's going to be a significant economic event because joining it wasn't. Indeed, even worse, that the immediate aftermath of joining the EEC and the immediate aftermath of completing the single market on both occasions were very big recessions where our growth rate took a very big hit. Now, I don't blame the EEC for the first one. That was more to do with international banking and oil crisis. I entirely blame the EU for the second one because it was the European exchange rate mechanism which ripped the heart out of our companies and our economy and led to boom and bust on a scale almost as big as Labour's boom and bust, which they then orchestrated at the end of the last decade, and that was why we did so badly. But what I want to talk about is a little bit more of the detail on some of the crucial sectors that I think have been badly damaged by our membership of the EEC, then the EU and the single market, where I think we can do rather better once we're out of the legal entanglements. Let's start with the most obvious and topical one this week, the fishing industry. When we first went into the EEC, we had a flourishing fishing industry with a very large number of trawlers and successful fishing ports in Scotland and England and Wales, and we had a net surplus in fish. We were an exporter of fish because we had had access to one of the richest fishing grounds in the world in our own territorial waters and beyond. And the common fisheries policy destroyed a lot of that. Many of our boats were lost, a lot of our fishing capacity was lost. We are now a heavy net importer of fish as a result of being part of the common fisheries policy, and our fishing grounds have been greatly damaged because they have allowed too many industrial trawlers to come in from outside to do damage to the seabed and to the shoals of fish that we once had, and the quota system hasn't really worked because of the discard policy. It is quite easy to design a UK fishing policy where we both have more fish to eat and we take fewer fish out of the sea. And you do that by not having the discards. And it's also quite easy to design a policy where the fish is landed in the UK, so there's more economic benefit for us in processing and selling it on, and where we have much more capacity in the English fleet and the Scottish fleet, so that we can capture more of the added value. And I look forward to the Secretary of State publishing a detailed strategy and offering us draft legislation. I look forward to the SNP supporting that legislation because they must know how important the recovery of our fishing industry is.
But Mrs Thatcher was a great heroine of the honourable member, and she said, just think for a moment what a prospect that is. A single market without barriers, visible or invisible, giving you direct and unhindered access to the purchasing power of over 300 million of the world's wealthiest and most prosperous people. It's now 500 million. Was she wrong at the time?
Always right, and as her chief policy advisor, I gave her extremely good advice on the single market, which she didn't actually accept. She took most of my advice on a lot of things, but I told her not to give the veto away. It wasn't worth it. We needed to keep control of our own lawmaking. The Foreign Office were more persuasive than I was, and that was where things started to go wrong, that we were tricked into accepting what she hoped and what a lot of British people thought was just going to be a free market where there were fewer barriers for trade, but we were actually entrapped into a massive legislative programme which went more and more controls, quite often of an anti-business nature, which were imposed even where the UK didn't want them, even where we had voted against, where we were in the minority. And so that is why a lot of the British public fell out of love with the common market they thought they'd voted for in the early 1970s. They thought it was just going to be about more jobs and more trade. They discovered it was about the EU taking control. And I'm afraid on that occasion, Margaret Thatcher was less than perfect. She, I think, didn't choose the right advice to follow. If only she'd vetoed the loss of the veto, maybe the Honourable Gentleman would be having his way and we'd still be in the European Union with a rather different relationship from the one which we were actually forced into taking. But let's take another industry. Let's take the energy industry. Now, under European rules, we have been, again, trapped into a common European energy policy, which meant that we've gone from being entirely self-sufficient in energy to being quite heavy importers, and there is a wish to make us more and more dependent on imported electricity and imported gas through interconnectors with the continent, meaning we have less security of supply, and we are more dependent on the goodwill of many people on the continent and ultimately on Russian goodwill because of the importance of Russian gas to the energy situation, particularly on the continent. Now, fortunately, we're still in a position where it hasn't gone damagingly too far, and we can rescue it when we come out. And our gas is much more dependent on Norway and on Qatar, not members of the European Union, and that is a very useful precaution that we have because we can trust those suppliers and it won't be subject to the same common problems which might arise in the European system. But we also need to be very careful about the framework of regulation. I'm all in favour of cleaner air and looking after the environment. But the rapid and premature closure of coal power stations before there are good, reliable alternatives are putting us in a bit more jeopardy. We've already had times when you have a cold day with big industrial demand and very little wind, it is extremely difficult balancing the system and keeping the full amount of power up that people want, and we may have to go on to industrial rationing in some cases. If we follow European policy and shut all the coal stations without having proper alternatives that are reliable and in place, it makes running a good industrial strategy that much more difficult. What would I put at the top of my list, Madam Deputy Speaker, for a good industrial strategy? I would actually put a plentiful and cheap supply of energy as my #1 need. Having in the past had jobs that involved running factories and dealing with transformation of materials that have a high energy content, I know just how important both reliability and relatively low price is for running certain kinds of process industry. And we see how the United States is now going to be reindustrializing because they're going to have access to a lot more cheap feedstock and a lot more cheap fuel as a result of their drive to have much more domestic energy at a time when we've been going in the other direction and where we're becoming more reliant on other systems that aren't so reliable, more reliant on imports, and finding that we are now becoming short and our power, certainly at peak demand, can be extremely expensive unless you have a long-term contract that properly protects you. So I would urge ministers to use the opportunity for a rethink on our energy strategy and put that at the top of the list for the industrial strategy they tell us they want, because it is the #1 requirement for a strong industry across the piece. I was talking to our honourable friend for Stoke-on-Trent the other day, and he was reminding me just how important cheap and readily available gas is to the whole potteries, and we want those industries to grow and flourish. I used to be involved a bit in those, and I think there is huge scope, but it does require a sensible UK-based energy policy. We then have the issue of the vehicle industry. Now, I think the vehicle industry is going to be just fine. I think it's been built with a lot of foreign investment and a lot of local talent into a very fine industry. But we need to remember its exact shape, that the UK has capacity to make about 1.7 million cars per annum, but it has the capacity to build 2.7 million engines. And last year, 1 million of those engines were diesel engines. And successive governments have done a very good job in persuading large motor manufacturers and engine manufacturers to come to the UK or to expand in the UK, and we now have this centre of excellence in diesel engine technology and engine production generally for passenger cars and light vans, which we should be rightly proud of. But it's very important that the government understands this achievement and doesn't do things that inadvertently damage it. And if you look at what happened after the Brexit vote, car sales continued to rise very nicely. We were experiencing a very strong market, and for the first 9 months after the Brexit vote, as was happening before, there was a good trend of car sales in the UK. And then from springtime last year, we saw a sharp reduction, and that has continued throughout. Why has this happened? Well, it is nothing to do with Brexit. It is to do with policy decisions taken in the United Kingdom. 3 things happened at the same time. The first is they decided that there were too many car loans being advanced, and there was a restriction on car loan credit. I think you can worry too much about that, because there is security, and the people who get car loans usually have reasonable jobs and income, and we're not looking to a set of job losses anytime soon, I'm pleased to say, so I can't really see the big problem. But there was also the imposition of much higher vehicle excise duties, particularly on higher value cars, which are the ones that are particularly profitable and successful to make. And then, of course, there was the general arguments that diesel is no longer acceptable. Now, diesel technology in this country and through European regulation has reached much higher standards of cleanliness and control of exhaust, and as far as we know, all these engines are more than meeting the legal requirements because we all want cleaner air. But if the idea gets abroad that actually all these standards are going to be tightened very quickly, or it's going to become unacceptable to run a diesel engine, then it puts people off buying. So we've seen a very big collapse in support for diesel engines and for diesel cars, which I think explains the pattern in that particular market. And I hope the government will look at sensible compromise. Yes, we want clean air, but we also need to say and do supportive things for what is now a very important industry in our country. I think there's huge scope for farming. I think the Secretary of State's made a start with his white paper, but it's still at a fairly high level of generality. And I look forward soon to more detail, because I think the motif of the policy must be that we can and should grow more for ourselves. Again, in the early days after we joined the EEC, we were about 95% self-sufficient in temperate food, the kind of food we can produce. And we're now under 70% self-sufficient, and we are importing a lot of food from the Netherlands and from Denmark, countries with very similar climates to ourselves, as well as importing quite a lot from Spain, where some of the things we could not grow for ourselves, although we could buy cheaper alternatives from South Africa or Israel if we were allowed to do so. So I think we need to look at all of that and do a better deal for the lower income countries that can sell us food we can't grow for ourselves without the same kind of tariff barriers, and we need to do a lot more work on how we can grow more of our own food.
Our own food kind of falls if we don't have the people here to pick the food, because it'll be rotting in the fields, as is already starting to happen, because EU workers who've come over to do that are leaving, and our own workers don't want to do that.
Yep.
Well, there's still quite a large number of net inward migrants coming into our country. And I look forward to higher wages and to more automation. I think all these problems are perfectly soluble. There are some very good automatic systems now for picking if people don't want to do those sort of jobs. And I also hope that there will be more productive ways of employing people so that you can pay them more. If they work smarter and they have more technology to support them, you can also pay them more, and it's good for the employee and it's good for the farming business. And some of it is about scale, some of it about investment, but I hope we will develop a farming policy which still provides public money to support farms in a sensible way, but I hope it will be more geared to the production of food and the successful sale of food, particularly domestically. I think we want fewer food miles on the clock, and rather more local produce. And I hope also the policy will allow and encourage more agricultural businesses in the United Kingdom to add value to the product coming from the field or from the shed on the farm, because that's a very important part of developing a prosperous and more successful economy. In an area like media, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the UK has enormous scope, because we have the huge advantage of the English language, an advantage we sort of largely share with the United States of America, who are also very good at media and internet-related businesses, and I look forward to the tech revolution being an important part of our better-paid jobs and more jobs in the future. And again, there will be opportunities once we're out of the EU, because we will be able to choose our own tax regime and our own regulatory regime. I trust we will choose a best-in-class, world-leading regime for both tax and regulation, because whilst I understand some of the irritations the EU and others have with existing large technology companies, it's very important that we also understand how phenomenally popular their services are, what hugely important wealth generators they are, what choice they're offering to customers, and the new jobs they're going to be creating. So we need a tax regime and a regulatory regime which is fair and not part of a trade war between the EU and the United States of America, which seems to be developing at the moment in an unfortunate way. Infrastructure, Madam Deputy Speaker, is very important, and I think one thing that perhaps unites the House is that we'd all like more investment in infrastructure. We then have disagreements about pace, style, and ways of financing it, but I think there is huge scope for more infrastructure in this country, and if we wish to take advantage of our greater freedoms and the kind of business developments I've been sketching in different sectors, we're certainly going to need a lot more capacity in road and rail. In rail, I think the capacity can be increased more cheaply and more rapidly if we go over to digital controls. One of the features of our railway system is we run very few trains an hour on any given piece of track, and with better controls we could increase the number of trains we run on existing track, which is a quicker and cheaper solution than having to build lots of new tracks. And I think in the case of road transport, we're going to need improved road transport, internet styles of purchasing, require road capacity for all the van deliveries that are going to be made when people bought on the web, as well as needing road capacity for those who still like going to a traditional shop and expect to find somewhere to park when they go there. And it's only those shopping centres that have got really good access and really good parking that are likely to really flourish in the current world, because people naturally want convenience. So I trust that the government will find sufficient public capital support for these necessary programmes, but also be imaginative in finding new ways of harnessing private finance where that is appropriate, as it clearly is in cases like energy and communications, where there are defined revenue flows which should be financeable through the private sector. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the aim of Brexit is to cheer the country up, to get the wages up, to get the jobs up. So far it's all going reasonably well, that there are more jobs after the Brexit vote, despite the false forecasts that pay is going up a bit. And we'd like more improvement in real pay, and it's good to see some moves being made in the public sector. The big Brexit bonuses we want comprise spending our own money, and can we please know when, how much and what we're going to get for it, having a fishing policy that makes sense for both British fishermen and British fish, having a better agricultural policy that means we can grow more of our own food, having an energy and industrial policy which supports more investment and more growth. Thank you very much.
The right honourable gentleman is an advocate of a united kingdom, especially when we're coming out of Europe. There is the vexed question of Northern Ireland, and how does he see that fitting in with his vision for the future? Because it's very important for Northern Ireland as part of our UK economy to understand, for example, where he is coming from in this matter.
And I trust, as part of the United Kingdom, will benefit from the economic policies I've been describing, and it is the settled wish of a majority in Northern Ireland that they stay part of the United Kingdom, and they are very welcome. If he's referring to the alleged difficulties over the border, I just don't think this is a serious, real problem. It's obviously a political problem because the EU wishes to make it a political problem. But what the EU needs to understand is that this border is already a complex border, because if you're moving goods either way between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, there is a currency change to be affected. There are different excise rates and incidents on each side of the border. There is a different incidence and level of VAT each side of the border. There are different income and corporation tax arrangements on both sides of the border. But we don't have a man or a woman at the border stopping every truck and working the sums out on what you have to do on the excise tax or on the currency at the border, because that would be ridiculous. If we end up with world trade basis trading, so that there do have to be tariffs at that border, it's no more difficult calculating the tariff electronically and charging it away from the border than it is charging the excise and charging the VAT at the moment. We know how to do it. It is not that complicated. We do live in the electronic age. I see the Labour Party wants to live in the pre-computer world and doesn't think we can send data electronically. I can assure them it is a magical development.
If I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, I mean, the slogan of the Leave campaign was "Take Back Control." What does that mean if it does not mean taking back control of your borders? There are movements of people that need to be considered. There will be a common travel area still between this country and the Republic of Ireland. You cannot simply introduce borders and then tell the British public those borders won't be physical or even in existence because somehow there'll be some digital solution to it. It is not practicable to say you're going to put those borders in place and then they won't exist.
The honourable gentleman has been here long enough to know that all parties have always agreed that we keep the common travel area with the Republic of Ireland. That's always been a given. It wasn't dependent on the EU in the first place, and everybody wants to keep it. But let's deal with the question of our UK external border, wherever it may be, and the issue of migration. Yes, the British people voted to have more controls over the number of people who come to work here and settle here. And the Prime Minister has promised on several occasions that she is going to get the net migration total down to tens of thousands from the 250,000 plus we've been experiencing each year, and I wish her every success with that. You do not need new hard border checks because, as I understand the way thinking is going in the government, the way I encourage, we just want to control two things. We want to control the right to work through a work permit system, and we wish to control the entitlement to benefit by making sure that people are properly qualified for benefit. And that doesn't require big controls at the border. Anybody is welcome to come as a tourist, anybody is welcome to come and spend their own money, anybody is welcome to come and invest. That isn't what we're trying to stop, and the things we wish to control we can do through a work permit system and through a benefit system.
I am listening carefully to the right honourable member, even out of a sense of morbid curiosity as to how he's going to explain practically the situation in Northern Ireland. We've heard a lot of abstract stuff too. We heard abstract ideas. We need practical solutions, and it's incumbent upon the right honourable member to give us a serious, practical way forward in relation to that problem, which is a very serious problem, notwithstanding what the right honourable gentleman says.
I agree, it is already a complex border. There are already anti-smuggling arrangements. There are already ways that satisfy both sides of the border about the possible passage of criminals and so forth. All those things will stay in place. They're not made that much more complicated by us leaving the EU, because the Republic of Ireland isn't part of Schengen. It doesn't have those special arrangements that the rest of the EU has. So it's making a mountain out of a molehill. Indeed, I don't even think it's a molehill. I just do not understand why serious people can think this is a serious issue. I understand why political people want it to be an issue, because they want to extract a price from the United Kingdom as if we hadn't already offered enough in the interests of friendly relations in due course with the European Union. But I'd like to reassure the Labour front bench, who are meant to be pro-Brexit and have a lot of pro-Brexit voters, that I cannot see any extra complication that cannot be solved with a bit of electronics and by development of what we already have, because it is already quite a complex border. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, huge opportunities. If we take advantage of those freedoms, we can boost our growth rate. I've shown in a few sectors how we can do it in those individual sectors. I've shown overall how we would do it by spending our own money. We have huge opportunity to rein in some of the excessive imports we're taking in at the moment by replacing them with home production. We can do many good trade deals around the world to extend and improve our trade, which is already good, growing and flourishing with the rest of the world, despite tariffs and WTO terms, which we know how they work, and they work just fine. So I just say to the government, let's get on with it, and let's not make any more concessions, and let's make sure that if we do end up with a deal, it's a deal worth having.